Okay, yes, so I had a really good session with the composers this afternoon. Very intelligent discussion, particularly around my professional work. And it's worth knowing that tomorrow in this room I'll be doing a 2-hour workshop with brass players and any others. So if you want to watch and see the work in action or join in, please come at 1 o'clock tomorrow, because it's essentially about practical work. Although tonight I'm attempting to put it into a more pedagogical theory and to abstract the work a little bit, but it is essentially practical. And it was very interesting when Lee asked me to do this, to think about the pedagogical implications as well as walking into a room and trying to make something happen. So form and freedom, it's about the relationship of form and freedom, and we'll work through that. Some of the issues, the nature of literacy. Literacy is a big subject now, because students arrive in schools and arrive in universities indeed with a very different kind of literacy, or no literacy, compared to the 50s or the 60s. The nature of practice, so the nature of practice both within education and within profession, because it's changing within profession in some areas quite fast. The relationship of theory to practice, because it can have a dynamic relationship or it can have a more separated relationship. The relationship of student to teacher, I'll come on to all of these things. Genre is a big issue because we now live in a pluralistic culture, and it's very easy to, at its worst in the British school education, they do raga one week, then counterpoint the next week, then blues the next. And genre can get terribly wrapped up in formula. You have a formulaic approach to what this music means, and I think one always has to keep open what music means. I've worked a lot across culture, especially with Asian musicians, and I'll talk about that. And we're well past the point of saying creativity is good, everybody should do it all of the time. We need to find the right place for creativity in the right learning context. And the craft of composition, it's a real skill and a craft. And behind a lot of what I'm talking about in particular is creative leadership by myself or by a composer or by a teacher or by a student taking over the leadership, but the nature of creative leadership. So, and tonight I'm focusing on it as a pedagogy, but it's more a way of life. It's certainly everything I say tonight applies to my professional practice as much to my educational practice. And that's also a very important point. I see absolutely no gap between them, and there is a problem if there is one. So first of all, I'm going to put a bit of music. It's going to be a bit abstract, but there'll be some music. This is my own ensemble, Note Inégale. Note Inégale is a French term for swing it in French Baroque music. So note égale is da 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 da. Note inégale da 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 da. It's the closest classical music ever came to jazz. So it's very awkward for English people to say, but you're all bilingual, so it all works for you. And it's a very good name for the group, at least philosophically, because we go left field as well as right field, and we swing as well as play straight, both, as it were, in philosophy and literally. So here's a little burst of Note Inégale. This is entirely improvised with me using signals. I gave a talk for the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, which is a rather high-minded international institute for using culture as a means of international dialogue, which is good, but it was getting a bit high-minded and frustrating, and I suddenly yelled out, the answer to most questions is both. And I realized, I realized how important that was to me, and I'm going to use that as the text, as it were, for the sermon tonight. That's the starting point for the pedagogy tonight. So, it seems to me one of the stupidest debates in the last 20 years has been, should English be taught through grammar or creative writing? And it goes backwards and forwards, and the obvious answer is both. It's the relationship of grammar to creative, well, it's not it's the relationship and the non-relationship, but it's important that in teaching writing, you work both creatively and with grammar. And that's the theme that I'm working with. So both what? A pedagogy of both. Both what? Here's some of the themes I want to look at. Score and improvisation. Skill development and exploration. Instruction from the teacher and response and individual response. Teacher as leader, definitely the leader, not just facilitator. Student as leader. Artistic professional practice in a real relationship with education, like as it is in other cultures, in a non-separated relationship. Dealing with literacy and non-literacy, whatever that means. Process and product. There was a big thing in the 60s, not the 60s, the 80s, in community arts in Britain, that process was more important than product, which I think is kind of blasphemous in an art, because product, you know, the making of the stuff, the reality of the stuff, is absolutely central to why we're artists. But process is important too. So process and product, not the kind of laziness of saying process is more important than product. Then obviously now we're dealing with both inherited culture and the shrinking of the world, and cross-culture, and genre and non-genre. We can get stuck on genre. Most education systems are everywhere now dealing equally, if that's the right word, with popular and classical sources, funk and free rhythm. And the teacher-director, this is something more subtle, the teacher being active in the musical situation and also standing outside the musical situation. So I'm passing through those themes, but underlying that is a notion of the dynamic relationship of these opposites, as opposed to, you know, you do one and then you get the other 10 years later, or one is held by the teacher and one is held by the student. It's the dynamic crossing and making and crossing of these boundaries is the kind of philosophic basis, as it says here. So it's the dynamic relationships, so that at any point the tail might wag the dog. So the improvisation becomes more important than the composition, or vice versa. The student becomes more important than the teacher, or vice versa. This is all philosophic, but I think you'll see how it applies as I go on. So long before Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, I was using the term third way. Somehow it got through to the White House. And I mean, Tony Blair messed it up, probably. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime was his starting point, which still makes a kind of sense. But anyway, let's not get onto that. The first way is the traditional way, the Victorian way, the way of closed authority. The image I use for that is of a containing box. So therefore you have a single point of authority and some kind of closed deterministic use of that authority. There's a school I worked in London that has a wooden fireplace on which is engraved, "Obey them that have the rule over you." And that's what you have to do. The second way is the way of the 60s. Equal, open choice. Hey, let's make a peace. What are we going to do tonight? Democratic, flat relationships, the image of the open space, free creativity, all decisions shared. I'm obviously being very black and white, or very hippie colours here as well, but psychedelic was the word I was looking for. I'm being psychedelic, but I'm trying to keep it quite simple. Third way, and I want to spend some time on this, is the idea of a strong centre, but from which you can spin off with multiple responses. A central line or impulse that creates ripples potentially to infinity. So it's begin here, or centre here, or ground here. The first way then is like a box, which you transgress at your peril. The second way is an open space, which is, someone once said to me their idea of the 60s was going into a classroom and lighting a bonfire, then getting the kids to write a poem about it. And that's what it was like then. So the third way is something like a line, a strong centre, but a line from which you can spin off. And you'll see what that's philosophic, that's abstract, but you'll see what I mean by that technically. So it's both centre and response. It's a both. It's both the grounding by the teacher or the situation and, in theory, infinite layers of response, in theory. So just remind us while we're here, this poem by Walt Whitman, "Oh, we can wait no longer. We too take ship, O soul. Joyous we too launch out on trackless seas, fearless for unknown shores, on waves of ecstasy to sail." So there's the wonderful Vaughan Williams and the wonderful Walt Whitman. And Vaughan Williams beginning of last century set, Walt Whitman. Trackless seas, fearless for unknown shores. We have to hold in mind that as artists, that's what we aspire to, that's what we seek. And holding that in tension with ground, center, framework, it is our task. But we're seeking the unknown, and therefore we're trying to set up situations in creative learning which are fearless. And fearless not just because, hey, let's have black today because we had red yesterday, but fearless emotionally, fearless spiritually, fearless in terms of understanding the breaking of boundaries and when you break boundaries. So art is very serious. You know, art isn't play. People like to say art is play. Art is really serious. It's not about being playful. It's about an approach to reality that's very tough, and not fearless because we're having fun chucking bricks around in the playpen, but fearless because we're dealing with really deep human issues and really deep human relationships. So that's why you need the ground, but you also, I'd like to remind you, we also need the trackless seas. Here's a little bit more music. This signal means do what you like. That signal means keep going through the red light, which is the stop. That means solo, aimed at the cellist. The light's not great, is it? So, form and freedom in music making. I'd like to just become a bit more abstract again. I'm talking about both. So both the relation of two things, and it's quite fun to think about all the different ways that two things can relate. So domination and submission is the one at the top. One may dominate the other may be submissive. Unfortunately, in our culture, there's a lot of dualistic thinking where never the twain shall meet. So there's this mutual separation of things in our culture. Man from woman, man and woman from God, civilized from uncivilized, man from nature. We've got a long history of separating us, me, men, whatever it is, from the other. Never the twain shall meet. Yin Yang, you're all familiar with, it's a Chinese concept of the evolution of the outer and the inner, or the male and the female, or the ascendant and the descendant, where alternation is in complete flow, and as you approach one, it becomes the other, and there's the dot, the point of one hidden in the other. And in fact, there's a lot of holistic thinking in the kind of thinking that I'm introducing. Two things can also relate through alternation and binary. We live in a binary world, don't we? Steve Reich is very binary, you know, clapping music. On, off, on, off, on, and so on. So there's a lot of, Stravinsky is quite binary. I think the relation of two things becomes more and more kind of subtle. Interference is a very interesting concept of the Danish composer Per Norgard, who talks about setting two things against one another so a third voice appears. So this kind of transcendent voice appears through the interference. I guess you could see that in Picasso or something at times. So that's a more high-level notion of two things. Contradiction, I think you find a lot in Stravinsky. It's obviously a principle of Marxism, where two things are put head to head to create a higher consciousness. Then we begin to approach things like paradox and alchemy and alchemical transmutation through you know, the meeting in the crucible of the hot and the cold, or of the fiery and the watery, or whatever. It's the convergence of the twain. So there are many mystical and metaphysical traditions in the world that talk about heightened awareness, heightened consciousness through the banging of the heads together, or whatever it is, the mediation between opposites. I have a favourite poem, and at one point I wanted to, we'll go back, yeah. Let's just reverse a moment. So then, when do two things not work? When it's bland fusion, when it's compromised, when it's fudged, when it's balanced, when it's shared, when it's fair, when it's equal. Two things don't work if there's some kind of sentimentality around it, if there's some kind of should around it. So I'm talking about dynamic relationships of two things. And as I say, that can reach a kind of alchemical notion, a shamanistic notion in some traditions. So my favourite poem, this is Thomas Hardy's The Convergence of the Twain, written about the Titanic. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event, till the spinner of the years said now, and each one hears, and consummation comes, and jars two hemispheres. Extraordinary poem about the cathedral of man meeting the cathedral of nature, and the kind of intimacy of that, and the inevitability of that. And there's a kind, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. That's a kind of alchemical or almost tantric kind of idea in early 20th century British poetry. So here then is a kind of, or is a definition of creativity, the jarring of two hemispheres, the dynamic interaction of opposites, the congruence of opposites. And so let's start to become more real and less abstract. Think about what the kind of things I'm talking about in terms of the score. So returning to the first, second and third way, the first way, the closed authority, score is almost unique in world music in the form that it took from whenever, 1650 to 1950 in Western classical music, in that the notion of the text, the notion of a text that's put in a library and has a fixed ownership and a fixed authorship. There's almost no other tradition in the world where authorship and ownership are so enshrined. You know, just to take one example, in Japanese traditional music, you learn a piece from your master, and then as you master it, you're allowed to make a new version of it. So therefore, authorship is evolving through the mastery of something and then the recreating of it. So authorship is to do with recreation or remaking rather than of a fixed Beethoven 5 score. I mean, Beethoven 5 is a wonderful piece of music, but we have to locate these things in time and place. And so structurally that fits in my first way. Second way, do you feel like lessons today? Shared authority, student authority, creative projects, child-centered. There's some problems about child-centeredness. The idea of openness and response and facilitation, and the loss of the yoke or the loss of the discipline. And then a particular idea that I've used for a long time, which is a third way kind of thinking, is a backbone, is a piece of music that carries the center of the music, but which can be realized and developed in all sorts of different ways. So you begin with this backbone, but there's in theory infinite ways in which it can be treated. So it's a mixture of a given and a responded. And it's, there's a bit missing there. Let me just try. Yeah, it's reinventing the wheel, because this is an ancient tradition. It's like the well, there are ancient traditions like this. It's like the cantus firmus in medieval Renaissance music, where you have a given strong line that holds the music together and different versions are made around it. It's like the clave in Latin music, where you have a set rhythm, da, 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 and it's the key rhythm, the clave, and everything is spun on that. Or in Javanese gamelan, the balungang is the central melody that is decorated in various different ways. So it's a tradition you find all over the world of a strong center, not a strong bottom like in classical music, a strong center around which there are variabilities in different performances or different realizations. There's a backbone. it's very, very simple. So that might be the basis of something in a classroom, but I would use this with my university students. It's very, very simple. It's very centered because the top line holds a certain motion. The bottom line sustains a pedal bass. But you can surround that with an infinity of different things, and I might do a demonstration in a moment. So it's a strong center, but and it's stable and strong, but you could decorate it and develop it in all sorts of ways for different musical or pedagogical purposes. And therefore it's a form of partial notation, not a full text with composer ownership, but a means of structuring a relationship with musicians that probably will be a live one. And I coined the term backbone. Lots of jazz bands and other bands use one-page scores where you ask the composer to give you the material just on one page, and I do that a lot with my ensemble, and then you develop the material with the ensemble. So you limit the scoring in order to introduce the music into a practical context where it can develop in all sorts of different ways. And the key principle is that there are multiple solutions. 3 practical examples. I thought it was going to say that, so I'll run to the piano. If your harmony is this, then there's only kind of one solution, and it's, if you like, dominant and submissive, but that's another whole story. But certain notes must go in a certain direction. That's a classical cadence. If you have a kind of jazz 1 6 4 2 5 1, so you can make that very elaborate, but it still has a functional direction. So that's, if you like, music that has single solutions or linear solutions. But if you take a Miles Davis kind of pedal bass, then against a stable center, you have a lot of harmonic movement, and whatever I was doing in my left hand could become even more complex. All around. So that's a very crude demonstration of something quite sophisticated, but there are kinds of musical languages that in their nature push you into single solutions, and there are other kinds which give you a stable center and propose to you that you should develop quite complex layers around it. And Miles Davis music in the electric period of the 70s with two or three keyboard players, 2 bass players, etc., demonstrates that, where he has very strong centers but amazing amalgams of sound around them. Stravinsky is like that often in the way he writes. Composer Berio often writes very strong centers, and then he calls it layers of the onion that ripple around. So while in one way what I'm talking about applies to all music, that you have a mixture of form and freedom, there is this more subtle thing where certain forms elucidate kind of paradoxical freedoms, higher levels of freedom, and others limit or enclose freedom. And that's the more subtle part that I'm trying to propose in this talk. A practical example, I did a piece called Bow Wave with the National Youth Orchestra in Britain 2 years ago, where I produced a backbone score, then worked with the orchestra for 10 days, 3 hours a day, and then performed with them on a national tour. And in the end, they played the piece from memory, they improvised, and it was staged. So it was a very interesting project. It was the first time they'd ever done it, and I'd like to give you a glimpse of that. I think also there's a very important principle of alignment in this. So, but if I choose the theme Bow Wave, which a theatre friend of mine suggested to me, then it's very interesting because the point at which the bow wave touches the water is kind of very, very thin. But the result, because I was imagining this huge ship, is a huge ship going through the water and a million ripples coming off it. So I chose a theme that has a very strong cutting centre to it and conceptually infinite ripples. So that fits the idea of surrounding a strong centre with layers of improvisation. So it's important in art and in the pedagogy that you align these things. For years I loved to work with Salvador Dali's melting clocks image, because then you have the notion of precision and what happens when it melts. So that's pedagogically a very interesting starting point. So here's a bit of the National Youth Orchestra. The player out the front is a 15-year-old cellist who the director of the orchestra told me loved to improvise on his accordion. So he's improvising out front on his accordion. How's this going to look? Sound. Play a bit more of that later, but it was amazing to work with an orchestra playing from memory and the difference that that made. So the key concept then in working with a one-page score or a backbone is the concept of realization, which is a wonderful Baroque term used in Baroque music for when the keyboard players are given chords and decorate them and so on. But realization is a wonderful part of music making in that you bring in something that's pre-prepared, and then with a group, which might be this orchestra here, or it might be 3 players, you realize the material. You color it, you add things to it, you develop layers around it. And maybe you fix that. I like to think, you know, ideally there are 3 parts to a musical method and therefore to a pedagogy. What's pre-prepared, what's made in the room, and what's left for improvisation in the performance along with what's fixed. And of course a dance choreographer would say, yeah, what's new? That's how dance choreographers work all the time. But in music we've got a bit stuck with this score that's finished before you get in the room. Whereas actually, once it's in the room, you know, I look at you and think, this is a slowish group, we'll do this one quite slowly. Or I look at you and think, somebody over there could play that middle part, you know, really spiky. And it becomes in the chemistry of the room, in the cooking of the room, which, as I say, is the way a choreographer might work as they work with the bodies around them. And therefore, I'm now saying, which should be obvious, is that the pedagogy I'm talking about is practically centered. There's theoretical aspects to it, there's philosophical aspects to it, there's practice aspects to it, you know, practicing in and practicing at home, as it were. But I'm proposing an essentially practical pedagogy. And that's, you know, most obviously about making music. Music should be made. Music is about the relationships through sound, but music is also an art that concerns human beings. So in that guitarist who you saw in the first picture he's now very successful working for Apple, but he was in my first year group, and in the second week I'd stopped something and I started again, and I looked at him and we went and played perfectly together, and that in a way that was it. That was the education. We looked into one another's eyes and played perfectly together. And we knew what we were learning from one another in that moment. So music is a performing art, and we learn through the act of relating in performance, whether they're an 8-year-old or whether the London Symphony Orchestra. So this is essentially a practical pedagogy to be real about music. If you're realizing a backbone, it might take the form of shared group work. A group of 5 people go away and do it, or it might take the form of a leader directing a team, and I'm particularly focusing on leading in this talk. So let's look at the keys to the process of this core central bit, realizing. Forming a band. In order to realize, you have to have a band to play. So this is about creating a band culture. There are 2 things about forming a band I think that are important. One is ground and one is permission. Ground then, in jazz they say don't improvise until the bass and drums are tight. So you don't do a saxophone solo until the bass and drums are tight. So in order to have a band, you need they need to get into the groove, whatever kind of groove it is. They need to hear, be responsive, need to reach a point very quickly, even if it's 8-year-olds, where everybody is conscious or participating in the action of everybody else, so that the drums and bass are tight, so that everybody is hearing what's cooking. They call it cooking, don't they, in jazz? And then that's fertile, because if the ground is cooking, someone will think, hey, why don't I do this? Whereas if the ground is messy, people will think, I don't know what to do. So whether it's with 8-year-olds or the London Symphony Orchestra, ground is really important, that the bass and drums are tight. And then what goes with that is permission. So, okay, so the bass and drums are tight, but what if the piccolo is just squeaking, or the contrabassoon is playing in a different time? What if, as I've said here, the tuba copies the piccolo? Say to the tuba player, you could play that high. What if someone who plays too many notes only plays 3 notes? Give them permission to only play 3 notes. What if someone who's very icy you encourage to be very fiery? So permission is clearly something that can last over 5 years with the relationship with people. But permission is very important. It's permission to do the other, permission to do what's there, or permission to do what's not there. But it's, of course, above all, an atmosphere in the room, a sense that I could try this. And it seems to me that balancing ground and permission is the key to making a band work. It's very easy to be kind of safe with people. Say, hey, just play that lick you played the other week. Now, that's not permission. That's encouraging them to be safe. Permission is, why don't you play that backwards? Or why do you always do that? Why don't you do what he does? Something that is provocative, something which suggests otherness in the context of being able to see the wood for the trees, in the context of knowing where you are. And it's very subtle, that, and obviously there's a lot of educators here, and you of course understand that as an educational technique, but it seems to me vital to maintain that sense of permission the whole time. And why I like working through bands is that a band only works if it works. You can have a very cozy theory from a musicologist and they will prove to you that it works. But if you hear someone playing a groove, it's either there or it's not there. If you hear people playing a fifth, it's either in tune or it's not in tune. So the nice thing about educating through working in a band is it only works if the band is cooking. And then because the band is cooking, learning just appears, because there's truth in the room. So, and the other thing about working in a band is there's no safe place. You've got to play, or you're seen not to play. There's no habitual place, because you can always challenge someone to do it differently. There's no familiar place, there's no theoretical place. So it brings music to the moment, and it's there or it's not there. And when it's there, you learn fast. You learn very, very quickly. When it's not there, you can discuss it for weeks, and you still may not understand what you're doing. So to break that down a bit, it's therefore for the band culture to work, the director or the teacher needs to be very, very clear. And I reckon there are only 3 things you can say to a player. Do this, do something like this, and the third one is, what would the third one be? Giving you permission here. Yeah, do what you like. Do anything, indeed. So there are the only 3 things you can say to people. Do this, do something like this, do what you like. And if you watch leaders, the good ones keep that clear all the time, and the bad ones muddy that the whole time. It sounds so simple, but just watch people doing it. So do this means owning your authority. I want this note, this short, this colour. No, 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 yes, got it. So then that's both because you want it, and also, of course, there's a respect in the clarity of that. I'm going backwards. Do what you like means letting go. It's the opposite. It means giving permission and trusting that they will do what they like. And it's not do what you like, but I hope you'll play high trills. It's do what you like. And that's where the muddle comes. So and you have to let go. You have to not hope. You have to let go. And then the middle one is very interesting. Do something like this, because that's the creative exchange. You might say play deep notes that you know, like the roaring of a fire. Or you might say use just B flat and A and just come in occasionally and make sure it interrupts. Or you might say a chord that's like the moon or a chord that's like the moon using these 4 notes, so they've got to find the voicing in the right part of the piano. So do something like this is a very, very interesting place to be, and it's totally dependent on the right thing at the right time with the right person. So it's dependent on spotting that someone is nervous and twitchy, so they'll do something that's really interestingly nervous or twitchy, or alternately ask them to be just completely still. It's spotting the one who's absolutely solid or even stolid, and then placing that against the one who's more likely to float. So, and it's spotting that George has changed from yesterday when he was rather cool to today when he's restless. But I'm using very simple terms, it's much more subtle than that. But do something like this is a people thing as well as a musical object thing. And it'll work if you get the right thing for the right person at the right time, and vice versa. So with a backbone kind of situation, you're often dealing with local solutions rather than genre solutions. So you don't have a bebop situation where the bass player, you say, do a walking bass, or where you say to the piano player, comp in the familiar way. One usefulness of this slightly more restrained notation is that there are multiple solutions, and therefore there are not necessarily specific genre solutions. So that's quite interesting. That I have an exam, which is my favourite exam, if you can have a favourite exam, where my students have to come in and there's a staff band playing, and they're given that, and they're given 10 minutes to turn it into a piece of music. And so it's very good. It's a perfect exam because you have to sight read, you have to conduct, and you have to be creative. So what would you do with that? Maybe it would be very good on a xylophone. Maybe it would be good on a xylophone, a semitone out from a piano playing it. Maybe a flute would spring off it with very similar notes with arpeggios. Perhaps something very high and floaty across it because it's very intense in the center. Maybe it would be very interesting Bartok-like with something similar but 2 octaves lower in the piano. Maybe it needs some punctuating stabs, which you can ask the piano player to do, and then ask the brass to harmonize that. So it's a very kind of unitary musical situation that you can use as a very interesting process. And as a teacher, you can use it to draw out the cellist and their ability to create bass lines. Or, of course, you can invite a student to direct it and make decisions. It often involves very crucial decisions, like what speed would it be? Because it's very different from ba, 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 ba. So this kind of work can. Stravinsky said once he had the pulse of a piece, he had the piece. So this kind of work, the openness of this kind of work, can reveal things like pulse. Exactly what is the speed? What's the motion of that? And that's the sort of underlying musical understanding, musical intelligence. And as I've said, this may be genre specific because you could do that last one a bit like Erik Satie or a bit like Bartok, or you could or like gamelan. Those notes could be kind of like gamelan gongs, but also you might do something which is only heard in that room that day and never heard again, with a grade 3 cellist and a stunning geography teacher playing the trombone who's just dropped by. So it's very, very flexible and makes its musical points through the problem solver. If you've got a brilliant geography teacher on the trombone, which I had when I was 14, I don't know why that's come back, and if you've got a cellist who's grade 3, solving that problem, and you've got that backbone, solving the problem is itself the musical education. What do you do so that both make authentic contributions to that situation and both learn from the other? What makes a good backbone? This is the first one that was written for me by, I think I can say, the distinguished British composer John Woolrich. We could spend a good time on why it's good, but one particular reason why it's good is each of those ideas is unitary. The first is a set of chords, the second fanfares, the third very fast or slow glissandi chords, and then the last one is a little bit more complex. But it's a very good backbone because the musical objects are singular and therefore very easily relate to other layers of musical objects. Who writes and why? You might write a series of backbones as part of a curriculum. The one that I've got there could be playable by 8-year-olds in 10 minutes, or it would be quite interesting to do that with the London Sinfonietta or something, and just so it's just da 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 and so on. It's very, very simple, but I love that term yoke, you know, like in yoga, yoke. It yokes you in and ensures certain decisions are made. So do this, do something like this, do what you like. What are the pedagogical educational implications of that? Authority within authority. So there can be layers of authority, because in saying doing something like this or do what you like, you're handing over authority. I've got some very interesting PhD students at the moment, and one writes quite a lot about autonomy and the development of an autonomous role within an educational or musical situation, a kind of post-Jungian. Because the 19th century orchestra, bless it, we love it, but it's built on a very child and parent structure where the it's not where there are layers of authority, and they're infantile sometimes. Let's just be straight. Whereas there are more modern ways of relating, where you're dealing with autonomy and adult relationships with shared respect for autonomous roles within something. So within this, I'm saying this very, very shorthand, but within this way of thinking, there's the possibility of authority within authority, or of ownership. In other words, ownership's very problematic in the 19th century orchestra, because of the ownership of the composer, or even the aristocracy, the composer, the conductor. Ownership is a very important issue, obviously, and something which we have generally have contemporary views of, that are very un-19th century. Authority with authority, but I'm also always talking about maintaining the tension with between teacher and pupil, or between pupil and pupil. Let me try to be a bit more concrete. Do this, do something like this, do what you like. Here's a curriculum example. Supposing do this is the instruction to develop a facility with the octatonic scale and its 3 transpositions. Do something like this is, on this given backbone, create a fleeting high texture using transposition 1. So a given creative application. Do what you like. It's not quite do what you like, but create your own 9-note scale also using symmetry. Make your own backbone from this. So the way I prefer to teach is like that. The important thing being maintaining the cycle, an active cycle. So you keep going from 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. So you actively instruct, invite creative dialogue between you and the student, and invite them to initiate the creative dialogue. And keep that in a dynamic, do it 5 times a day. Keep that in a dynamic relationship. Not, we do term 1, we do this, term 2, we do something like this. The dynamic meeting of these things is crucial. Oh, a little side thing, the importance of discipline. I once heard a Balinese dancer talk about the fact that since the age of 6 he'd had to practice the 56 eye positions for 3 hours a day. And his father would come up and say 39, and he'd do that, and 41, and he'd do that. But it's worth remembering how important discipline is to the arts. And in particular Asian culture, they have years and years of this incredibly rigorous discipline. But it's just a reminder that it's really, really important. And now we're thinking about the relationship of such an attitude, which is rigorous, with creativity. We are in danger if we overemphasize creativity to the non-understanding of the importance of artistic discipline. Maintaining the tension. The role of the teacher, I will talk a little bit more as we go. I as a teacher am always an active participant. So I play, I join in, I might write backbones for it. And that's generally how music has worked across the world through history, that the teacher has been active in the relationship with the student. And personally, I think that's much more healthy, that you are exposed as an artist, you're exposed as a performer, and you engage with the making of things along with students, because that's how they learn. I had I've gone back to my geography teacher again. When I took up the trombone when I was 14, and we used to sight read, and I stood next to this geography teacher, and we'd play things every week, and I absolutely loved it. And then a new trombone teacher came along. He said, right, no more of that sight reading. You've got to do studies for a year. And I gave up the trombone. So obviously all this is to get my geography teacher back. What we're looking for in the band, this band that we've now formed, whether it's top professionals or 8-year-olds, is the best of three things. And I think this is, again, this is reinventing the wheel. This is what's happened in music throughout history. What is pre-prepared, whether it's scored or in the memory of the performers, what's realized in rehearsal, what's special to that day, and what's left for spontaneous improvisation in performance. So here's a bit more of the National Youth Orchestra piece with some more improvising as well as what they've memorized. Thank you. More later. Those boys who were shouting through their megaphones were wonderful. They went on for 2 minutes sometimes in the rehearsal. It was like Monty Python. So one day I want to do a performance so we just let them go, you know, because... So just a few thoughts. I'm talking... Obviously improvisation is a very big part of what I'm talking about, and improvisation needs limits and it needs coaching. I'm conscious of time now, but I'll just say a few things about that. Here's my favorite coaching exercise for composition. Soloist A plays for a bar or a period, initiates an idea. Soloist B responds. Soloist A picks it up again. Soloist B responds. And then A takes that on a walk for 4 times the length, for 4 bars. And then it reverses B, A, B, A, B, 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 B. That's my favorite exercise because the difference between 4 bars and 1 is infinite for that player at that time, because they've got an idea, then they have to take it on a trajectory, beginning, middle and end, and close it. So when I used to be at the Guildhall, I would spend hours doing an exercise like that, and of course it needs coaching. You can say to people, use less notes, or why do you always finish 1 bar from the end, or this time do it like a pig rather than a horse, whatever it is. But obviously the relationship and the coaching is the key bit, but a very, very simple form like this is what elucidates the fact that they can't finish phrases, or they can't start phrases, or you know, they're trying to hide, whatever it is, or they always play around a certain register, whatever it is. And such an exercise, again, raises interesting pedagogical issues, the role of the teacher, the role of the student, whether you have a mixed ability class, because you could do that with a mixed ability class, what the nature of the literacy is, because you could do it all on 2 notes, or you could do it all with complex jazz chromatic harmony. But what I like about this is that fluidity. You could do, one person could be playing complex jazz chromatic harmony, and somebody else could be playing a two-note bass line. And therefore, it's quite useful now, given that one is always finding classes of mixed ability of one kind or another. There could be more than one long talk about the nature of coaching. I have two very simple principles, I think, in coaching. One is to go with and one is to go against. So if someone's very fiery, you go with their fieriness or you go with water. You don't go with sheep or lions or something. You stay with the quality of energy they have and work closely with it or closely against it. But that's like a lifetime's work in one sentence. But I think how you coach, of course, is critical, and you can make anything special by coaching well, and you can make anything special terrible by coaching badly. And the point I think I've already made, that in this kind of work you're dealing with a person as much as a pupil or a second year or a cellist. The nature of this open situation with the backbone means that you expose the person as well as the musical role, because they can't fall back on what a cello does in Baroque music or what a saxophone does in jazz if the stylistic situation is more open. Therefore that bumps them into finding authentic solutions, not given solutions, and then that is often linked to who they are as a person as well as what they've learnt in terms of genre or something. I was going to talk a little bit about coaching composition. Composing is very, very hard. Again, there's the sort of assumption that everyone should compose now. Every 8-year-old should compose, every university student should compose. But composing is very, very hard. Mahler found it hard, Beethoven found it hard, Mozart didn't find it hard, but that's fairly exceptional. And I think we cheapen composition by saying it's easy, everybody can do it. It's actually really, really hard, composing, and we need to kind of, whilst encouraging everybody to participate in it, also maintain our understanding of how difficult composing is. Anyone can write page 1, very few people can write page 21 in composing. So I think there's a kind of grown-upness in respecting how difficult composition is, and in, you know, the process always being to do with authenticity and truth rather than just making stuff up. I love this story. I once was coaching someone, and he told me this fantastic story about what this piece was about, which was about stars flashing through space and intergalactic interrelations and black holes. And I couldn't see anything in the score. So I pointed to an oboe trill and said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a black hole." And it was a wonderful moment, because for him it was a black hole. For me it was an oboe trill. One oboe trill in the middle of an empty space. But that's what we do as artists. We trick ourselves. We have fantasies about what we do. And in teaching we have to get beyond the fantasy. No. How do you actually write a black hole? Not think you've written a black hole. So I was talking to Lee about this. Everything I've said before, of course, depends on the teacher, and I've already started to talk about that. So a brilliant teacher will do first way, second way, third way, fourth way, and whatever they do, it will be stunning. And a terrible teacher will do a perfect third way, and it will be a disaster. So we're also, and this is another subject, another talk really, but we're also dealing with what is the nature of good teaching. And just a couple of thoughts about that. One is presence. That the teacher, I've already said, the teacher is present as a person, and in this case, as an artist, as a musician, as a lover of sound, as a maker of sound. And we were talking a little bit about this last night with Don, but there's also in leadership, I love the phrase, invoke, don't describe. So you are representing maybe not the right word, you are embodying what is wanted as much as describing what is wanted. I'm sure every good teacher would say that anyway, but embodying rather than describing, because you can describe for hours and people say, well, did you mean F sharp or G, and was it meant to go up? If you say exactly the right word, it will happen around you. To the extent of, this is a little bit more mystical, but there's a Tibetan tradition called the tradition of the secret voice, which means it's not what the teacher says, it's the tone in which they say it. And again, I think a good teacher knows that. A good teacher would say, look at the time, and it will fill the classroom with some sense of something. So we mustn't ever forget in pedagogies that we're dealing with a person with a presence in the room. Just a little glimpse of this, because the band principle has been, as I'm saying, making the best of who is there. Just wanted to show you a short glimpse of when I was working in Bahrain last year, and I'm quite involved now with Middle Eastern musicians, and with young people, a quarter of whom were classical, a quarter were classical Arab, a quarter were jazz, and a quarter were Spanish guitar players. And that's a kind of typical classroom situation now. And just a glimpse of, it was a very difficult 2 days, but a glimpse of the final concert I did with these Bahraini musicians. I've got a 38-minute film of that, sort of a shape of that day, if anyone would be interested to see it at some point. So moving towards the end now, performance, what we like with musicians, what we like about being musicians is this point of no return, the performance. It's me working with my student group in Brunel, and we're very lucky that we have that kind of arena within which there's no escape. I think that's one of the most satisfying things about being a musician, and therefore to be shared always in education. I think the final point I would make is that anything educational must be to do with understanding where you are now. It's very easy to be sentimental about, you know, music was fine until Stockhausen and Cage came along and ruined it. Or that, you know, what we need now is popular music, we should forget classical music. But the most important thing about teaching, as about composing, is dealing with where you are now. So now we deal with social networking, we deal with, you know, some of my students play laptops rather than violas. But it's really important, as our friends here who are going to appear on the next slide, I hope. Here's some people: Vaughan Williams and Walt Whitman, Stravinsky, Bach, Einstein, John Cage, Marx, Miles Davis. People who live their art or their philosophy through their time and connected with their time. And that, I think we have a responsibility as teachers to look around and absorb what's going on now, from John Cage through to the Arctic Monkeys or whatever, through to what's emerging from Japan now, or whatever. In doing so, we happen to have two new institutes at Brunel University where I am, one for composing, which we're doing in association with the Aldeburgh Festival. So that will ask existential questions. Do we need composers anymore? Is it all going to be improvisation? What's the nature of the performer now? The other one is the Institute for Contemporary Middle Eastern Music. So we are the first institute in the world to bring a focus to the new music emerging from the Middle East. So finally, the end of my piece with the National Youth Orchestra, where the conductor is, the orchestra turn away, this big ship goes off in the other direction, the conductor is frozen. I don't know if that's symbolic. And it ends with a quiet condenser, a quiet coda. Thank you very much.
Can read that they are focused on product, and China has transcended everybody. So product is everything. If you're coming to the market to buy anything, it's available for $1,000, $100, and even for $1.
Yes.
So what's your comment? Where is the civilization right now toward this concept of process and product?
I think that, I don't know how Steve Jobs would answer that, but I think it's saying how important the arts are, because the arts cannot sell things for $1 philosophically. You know, everything has to be $1,000 if you make a commitment to it. So I think it's the antidote to that is the humanizing of the arts, I would say, and the fact is that you can't be cheap in the arts. If you're cheap in the arts, you're exposed. If you bullshit in the arts, or if you're cheap, or you cut corners, it's not good music. Is that? So that's a little bit of a positive answer, but I think the arts stand for the right kind of quality, the right kind of relationship between humans, and therefore in schools, very, very important that people do music and engage with one another, whether they're going to be musicians or not, engage one another through getting something in tune or the rhythm right or a creative sharing of something. We are, yes, dematerializing music is important.
I'm wondering, in the exercises where you're asking the band to improvise,
yes.
I'm wondering if you ever ask them to try to improvise together in a certain way. I'm just thinking of a parallel with dance, contact improv.
Yes.
Or are they sort of creating completely in their own element?
The one thing that music's very good at is role playing. So you have the bass, the drone. When I use signals, this is a drone, a single note. This is repetition. This is a solo. So often musicians are very good at adopting roles within a situation. But I do a lot of work, yeah, where it's like contact improvisation. There's a very interesting exercise where if I use this sign to mean harmonize. So one person plays something, and then the next person has to play the same rhythm but their own notes. And that produces always a kind of Stravinsky harmony, extraordinary, as a group of people decide to make their own positioning. It's a kind of harmony you can't write. But if you ask 6 people in a row to spontaneously harmonize, you get an extraordinary kind of contact with a mixture of closeness and oddness. But and in free improvisation, of course, there's a lot of what some people call swarming, you know, a lot of people flowing together towards shared sounds. I think it's interesting music to work with, sometimes with swarming, like loss of one thing in another, and other times it's separation. That's the bass, that's the tune. And we hear the roll very clearly, and that's also very satisfying.
I'm wondering if you've noticed a pattern in when you're asking for these improvisations towards swarming or the opposite of that.
Yeah, separation into
Yes.
roll. Whether you can.
Have you noticed a pattern? What, like, in terms of the products of everything that you have seen when you're asking a band to engage in an exercise like that? Do you notice that they tend to either swarm or separate?
They play for safe early on. I mean, of course, yeah, they'll cling to one another. So often what I'm encouraging is separation, actually. Because if someone does something in the middle, someone else does something a bit in the middle, and someone else...
Right.
So actually this thing of autonomy, of charging your own path through a shared space is really interesting. And on the other hand, the swarming, you have to be incredibly sensitive to make swarming work, because you need to lose yourself in somebody else, which is kind of a very humble thing. So the permission thing is about getting people to be really lost in one another, followed by being really separated from one another. I think then I can relax if there's that degree of space between being absolutely together and absolutely separate. I think that's my job, to keep pushing out, so that you hope you can breathe within a space that can have togetherness and separation, craziness and sanity, hot and cold.
Can you use these same strategies in choral music? I use it in choral speaking and drama and that kind of thing, but how does it work?
Well, Lee's making me do a workshop at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with 5-year-olds, are they? 4-year-olds?
Yeah, they're about 8 or 12 year olds.
You are the luckiest, because that's the perfect age for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, in principle, it's exactly the same. You might have to support it in different ways, or, the great thing about a band is you can have roles: bass player, guitar, drums. It's kind of easier than having everybody doing the same thing. But it's perfectly possible pedagogically to use the same thing with songs and so on. It's interesting you use the word strategy. My closest colleague, Martin Butler, who's a very good composer, is always using the word strategy. It's a very useful word, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
As a composer, you adopt strategies, and as a teacher, you adopt...
I call it strategic teaching, right?
Yeah. It's a very useful word. And composers use that word, that compositional strategies is a useful word.